One of the first big moves Dan Morgan made as the Panthers GM last year was to trade away star edge rusher Brian Burns to the Giants. Looking back at it nearly a year later, did it turn out to be the right decision for Dan and the Panthers? I'll tell you right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, because on Fridays throughout the entirety of the offseason, I'm right here on the show answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Today is going to be the start of an evaluation of Panthers general manager Dan Morgan over the next week. I'm going to look at all the trades he's made so far. He's made 9 trades as the Panthers GM. I'm going to look back at the Brian Burns trade from a year ago. Going to look back at the Deontay Johnson trade saga and look back at some of his draft night trades and the other trades that he made this past season. Also, want to look back at his free agency class. Want to look back at his draft class and just give an overall grade on how Dan Morgan has done in year one as the Panthers GM. I also plan on doing this with Dave Canales, still trying to figure out how I'm going to go about that in the coming weeks. But over the next 3 days, going to look back at the trades that Dan Morgan made. Then next week, get into some of the other things that Dan Morgan's done so far as the Panthers GM, as the Panthers are now in the midst of a very important offseason here in 2025. Bryce Young is the quarterback for this upcoming season. Will he be the quarterback for the future? We'll find out. Dave Canales said, we found our quarterback. Dan Morgan mentioned how it's so much easier heading into the offseason, not having to answer the question of who's going to be under center for this organization in 2025. It's going to be Bryce. We'll see whether it's going to be Bryce in 26 and 27 and beyond. And Mike Kay, certainly, after having that conversation with him yesterday, wants to see more out of Bryce, and that it would not be the wisest thing to say that, yes, right now he is absolutely the franchise moving forward, but things are headed in the right direction, I think, in large part because of the moves that Dan Morgan has made over the last year as the Panthers general manager. But starting off this series, I want to start off by talking about the trade that he made last March on the first day of free agency, sending Brian Burns, the Panthers star edge rusher, to the New York Giants and deciding not to pay Brian Burns $30 million per year, which is something a lot of fans, even though it wasn't their money, did not want to see the Panthers do, leaving the Panthers with a massive gaping hole there on the edge rusher spot, trying to figure out what they would do in 2024. So looking back at it, this time last year, we were constantly talking about what were the Panthers going to do with Brian Burns? Were they going to extend him? Were they going to give him the 5th-year option or the franchise tag, rather? What were they going to do? And I felt like it was very clear that they had to at least tag him to give them an opportunity to continue the negotiations, potentially all the way until the middle of July 2024, but they could not let him walk for nothing. You got to tag him, then potentially trade him, or sign him down the road. I wanted to see the Panthers re-sign Brian Burns to a long-term deal. It did not make a lot of sense to me for a team that had an opportunity to reportedly give him away, or trade him away, rather, because it's not a giveaway, for 2 first-round picks to the Los Angeles Rams a couple of years ago, and then decided not to do that. And Dan Morgan was a part of that staff here in this front office with Scott Fitter as the general manager, and he agreed that they should not have given up Brian Burns. He wanted to keep Brian Burns in Carolina, so it did make a lot of sense to me. If you're going to pass that up, you weren't going to get the same compensation. You weren't going to get anything close to that, knowing that he was going to have the franchise tag. It was going to cost the team immediately to extend him, and there wasn't that ability to have him in-house for a season, to have time to negotiate. It was going to have to happen right away. So I felt like the Carolina Panthers should re-sign him. Of course, as we know, they decided not to do that, and they traded Brian Burns away and a 5th-round pick. That was pick number 166 in this past year's 2024 NFL draft to the New York Giants for a 2nd-round pick. That was pick number 39, a 5th-round pick. That was pick 141, and an upcoming 2025 5th-round pick. Now, looking at the picks the Giants sent to the Carolina Panthers and the picks the Panthers sent to the Giants, that one pick, these are the selections that were made once those teams respectively received those picks. So the Giants got Brian Burns, but sent the Panthers a 2nd-round pick, a 5th-round pick, and a 5th-rounder next year. In 2024, the Panthers, with that pick number 39, ended up not using it. They traded it over to the Los Angeles Rams. Braden Fisk, the defensive tackle out of Florida State, he was taken with the 39th overall pick. Pick 141 in the 5th round, that was actually utilized by the Buffalo Bills in the Xavier Legette trade, for the Panthers trading up to get Legette in the 1st round. Cedric Van Pran Granger, a center out of Georgia, went to Buffalo. And of course, Carolina has not gotten to the 2025 NFL draft just yet, so they have not used that 5th-round pick. The Panthers pick that they sent to the Giants, along with Brian Burns, that was a 5th-round pick. That was pick number 166. That ended up being Tyrone Tracy, a running back out of Purdue. And remember, Tyrone Tracy was the player on that Giants team in Munich and the game the Panthers won in overtime, who fumbled the ball on the opening possession in OT, setting up the Eddie Pinheiro walk-off field goal. So looking at it, the Panthers gave up a pick that ended up being a player who helped them win that game that Sunday there in Germany. So right then and there, that is a positive to come out of the Brian Burns trade. But a few notes coming off of that trade. Brian Burns landed a 5-year deal worth $150 max, $87.5 million guaranteed. So that's $30 million per year guaranteed. Carolina apparently wanted to give him a deal similar to what Max Crosby's received in Las Vegas with the Raiders. Max Crosby certainly has been an outstanding player, and looking at what he's done so far throughout his career compared to what Brian Burns has done so far throughout his career, he has been a better player than Brian Burns. So the deal that Carolina was offering certainly was a respectful deal. But typically the way these things go, as we talked about back then, is you look at who got paid recently, you look at the age of a player, and Burns is a young prospect coming out of college at FSU, that would usually yield more money than the last guy who got paid. That's how the quarterback markets played out. That's how receiver markets played out. That's how the defensive tackle, edge rusher, a lot of these markets have played out as the salary cap in the NFL has gone up. But Carolina, with a limited salary cap last year, wanting to rebuild this team with Samir Suleiman going out the door as their cap guy, with Scott Fitter being fired and Dan Morgan taking over, they weren't willing to give Brian Burns that kind of money, knowing that this team had a long way to go, having just gone 2-15, now with a head coach and a quarterback who was entering his 2nd year of a lot of questions in Bryce Young. They weren't ready to commit that kind of money to Brian Burns. And a premium position, mind you, they didn't want to give him $30 million per year, and I can understand. That's a lot of money. I thought maybe 25 to 27 million would make sense for Brian Burns, but 30, that was a lot to potentially give up for Carolina, and the Giants were willing to do it. Now, also think about this. The Panthers got an extra 2nd rounder by making this trade. They already had pick 33 as being, of course, atop the 2nd round. Now getting pick 39, that was going to allow them the flexibility to maybe do some more things, possibly trade up or trade back to get more assets. Having multiple 2nd-round picks, multiple picks there in that top 40, that put them in a very prime position. And what do you know? What did they do? They ended up trading from 33 all the way up to 32 there in the 1st round to get Xavier Legette and the 5th-year option. They probably don't do that if they don't have pick 39. Dan Morgan has a philosophy of wanting to have a pick in every single round, which makes a ton of sense. So if he did not already have 2 2nd-round picks, I'm not sure if he decides to move up even just one spot for Legette and that 5th-year option. You can question whether they took the right receiver there and if the 5th-year option was even worth moving up for at that point in time, but still, they likely they didn't want to wait another day. And he called up his old buddy, Brandon Beane, who had been here in Carolina and who he's with back in Buffalo before coming to Carolina to be the AGM under Scott Fitterer. And they made that deal happen. That does not happen if a month earlier He does not trade Brian Burns away to the Giants and get that extra second round pick. Also, look at this as well. Pick number 141. That is a pick that they also got from New York. That was sent to Buffalo along with 39 in order to get Xavier, or give along with 33 rather, in order to get Xavier Leggett. So they trade away Brian Burns, got the extra second, felt comfortable enough moving on from 33 to 32, giving that to Buffalo, and the extra fifth round pick they got, 141, that ended up becoming Cedric Van Pran Granger, the center out of Georgia, to Buffalo. They were able to send that also. So the fact that they traded away Brian Burns, that gave him an extra second rounder, that gave him an extra fifth rounder, and they were able to use those picks to get Xavier Leggett, and we'll see what he's able to do moving forward. And they still had pick 39. And also another thing here, pick 166 that they sent over to the Giants, that ended up becoming Tyrone Tracy Jr., the running back who fumbled the game away in overtime there in Munich. That comes from the Christian McCaffrey trade that they sent him a couple years ago to San Francisco. Just a couple of notes there as far as looking at it. So when you just look at it on the surface, didn't want to spend a lot of money on Brian Burns, did not do that. You look at it, it's like, okay, you get a second round or a fifth round or another fifth. Like, that's not that great. But when you use that fifth rounder coupled with the second rounder you already had those earlier and already have a second rounder again, you're comfortable enough to move up a spot there at 33 to get your receiver, get the fifth-year option, and still be able to sit there, have a second-round pick, have a fifth-rounder later on. Like, that ended up being some pretty good business there, just looking at it just from this perspective. But there's another way you got to look at this as well that was vitally important with the Carolina Panthers getting Brian Burns, or trading away Brian Burns, and what they got back in exchange. It's the extra second-round pick that they now have in 2025. It's a second-round pick that they did not have because they traded away when getting Bryce Young to the Chicago Bears. They now have a second-rounder because of this Brian Burns trade. We'll talk about that and the implications for the Carolina Panthers heading into this upcoming draft in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of the endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes? Well, now that's a thing of the past. You see, taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with a TurboTax expert who can get to work on your return right now. Now, no more waiting for answers. No more wondering if you're missing out on deductions. Whether you've got one form or 20, TurboTax experts give your taxes their undivided attention while you get real-time updates on their progress, so you can focus on what really matters. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes are being handled by the pros. Ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Live, full service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. I think back to when Dan Morgan and the Panthers made that trade, sending Brian Burns to the New York Giants in exchange for a second-round pick, number 39 in the 2024 NFL Draft, the fifth-round pick, number 141, and a fifth-round pick here in the 2025 NFL Draft. A lot of people weren't happy about what the Panthers got back. A lot of folks thought at least be able to get a first-round pick or get the equivalent of a first-round pick. And looking at this, a second and 2 fifths, that is not the equivalent of a first-round pick. And it certainly is not a first-round pick the Panthers were getting back in exchange for Brian Burns, an elite pass rusher who the Giants were willing to pay $30 million per year over the next 5 years to be their premium edge rusher there in New York. You weren't happy about that, but it's always important to understand, what are the Panthers, when they got it, what are they going to do with those picks? Who are they going to select? Who are those players who can be game changers for the franchise and help them moving forward? Well, of course, as I just mentioned, pick number 39, they didn't draft anybody. That ended up being Braden Fisk, and he plays the Los Angeles Rams. And you look at that fifth rounder, pick number 141. They also did not draft anybody with that pick. That ended up being Cedric Van Pran Granger, the center out of Georgia, who now is a Buffalo Bill. So 2 of those picks are not Carolina Panthers. So considering that, how did that work out to be a positive for the Panthers? They gave away Burns and they got back 3 picks, and 2 of them they didn't even use to bring in players who could replace Brian Burns or at the very least help out the team in the long run. Well, here's the important thing about that. You go back to that second round pick that the Panthers got, having 33 and 39. We spent a lot of time leading up to the draft talking about what should the Panthers do at 33 and at 39, as those were their first 2 picks into 2024 NFL draft. Do they go receiver at 33, then at 39 go cornerback? Do they go edge rusher? We talked all about that. Well, what turned out to happen was they took 33 and 141, and they sent that to Buffalo for 32 and took Xavier Leggett. And they still had number 39 and were in prime position to go out there to get an offensive lineman if they wanted to do that, to get a defensive player like an edge rusher they wanted to do that to replace Brian Burns. What did they do instead? They decided to send that pick over to the Los Angeles Rams. What was happening at that point in time in the 2024 NFL draft is that there was a run on defensive tackles. And the Rams were looking at it and they were concerned about whether they were going to be able to get their guy up front, knowing that Aaron Donald, remember him? You'll see him one day in Canton. He retired last offseason. They had to find someone to replace him, or at the very least come in and to be a starter, because they're never going to replace Aaron Donald, but they needed someone to help out on the defensive front. And they watched at 35 as Atlanta took Rukaroro out of Clemson. They watched as the Washington Commanders took Johnny Newton out of Illinois. They looked at 38 and saw the Tennessee Titans took Devondre Sweat out of Texas. So they were starting to think to themselves, okay, that's 3 defensive tackles in the past 4 picks that have gone off the board early on in the second round. Can we afford to wait any longer? And he decided no. They gave Dan Morgan a call. And they said, Dan, we need pick 39. What's it going to cost? And Dan said, you know what? I'll take your second round pick right now this year. You guys are at 52. We'll slide back to 52, 13 picks behind. We'll get back a 5th round pick, because I traded away a 5th rounder last night to get up there to get Xavier Leggett at 32nd overall. So I'd like to get a 5th rounder back. And you know what? Since you're desperate and you don't want to miss out on a defensive tackle, and I'm helping you out right now, right? I'm helping you out, Les Snead, the general manager out there in Los Angeles. I want your 2nd round pick next year. Because right now, we don't have a 2nd round pick. My good buddy, who's no longer here in Carolina, Scott Fitterer, decided to give up our 2nd round pick, along with DJ Moore and a lot of other things, in order to get to number 1 and get Bryce Young. And we're not quite sure Bryce is going to be the guy right now, but we need a 2nd round pick next year. I don't want to have that big gap. And Les Snead said, you know what? Done, Dan. You can have 52, you can have 155, and you can have our 2nd round pick from a year in a year later. That is one of the most important things that come out of the Brian Burns trade. Now, what the Panthers do, of course, with that 2nd round pick will be vitally important. We'll go back and look back at this. Like, I want to continue as I track all these trades that Dan Morgan has made. I want to continue to reevaluate, to assess these trades and find out whether the Panthers really made the right decision. And I guess you can't come out and say with 100% certainty that they made the right decision. But when you consider that you were able to trade away Brian Burns and you used the extra 2nd round pick, having that and that 5th round pick in order to get up to get Leggett and 5th-year option, to move back, to be able to get a 2nd rounder, which you gave away the year prior in getting Bryce Young when you trade up to number 1 Chicago. Like, that's good business. Absolutely, that's good business. And the picks that they ended up giving up, or they got, that in pick number 52, that ended up being Adonai Mitchell, the wide receiver out of Texas. He's an Indianapolis Colts. The Panthers got that pick, and they sent it to Indianapolis. You look at the other 5th round pick, 155. Panthers also got rid of that pick. That ended up being Jeremiah Trotter Jr., who's a linebacker out of Clemson for the Philadelphia Eagles. They, of course, have not used that 2nd round pick in 2025 yet. And in 2024 pick, the Panthers gave up to Los Angeles. Number 39, of course, became Braden Fisk. So A+ for the Panthers or for Dan Morgan, really, to be in that situation, to be able to get a 2nd round pick. And we talked about this back in April, how important it was that he was able to manage the draft in that manner and to have them in a position where they have the Rams 2nd rounder. And it looked a lot better early on this past regular season when the Rams are struggling with injuries, the Panthers maybe would be drafting very early in the second round. That will not be the case as LA ended up winning their division, and we'll see. I'm recording this before the Monday night game against the Vikings there. That's in Arizona. We'll see how that plays out. Either way, I think a bravo is in order for Dan Morgan. It was back then, and I said, and I'll say it again today, that is an important piece when you look back at the Brian Burns trade that cannot be ignored. So taking that into consideration, along with what the Panthers used their other draft picks for that they received in the Brian Burns trade, did they make the right decision? As this is still not a great pass rush, did they make the right decision almost a year later, trading away Brian Burns? Talk about it here in just a moment on Locked on Panthers. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of my favorite memories was attending a concert last year. The energy and excitement were unforgettable. Now, Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite live events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And right now is the perfect time here in the winter. Want to get out, don't want to be stuck in the house all day. Go find a great game to go check out on Game Time. Go find a concert. Go find anything going on in your town. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. We are revisiting the Brian Burns trade the Panthers made back in March of last year and trying to figure out almost a year later, did the Panthers make the right decision? Did Dan Morgan, the Panthers' newly minted general manager, make the right decision? Now looking back at all that has occurred since then. And to go back, Brian Burns and a 5th round pick, that was pick 166, the Panthers sent to the New York Giants in exchange for pick number 39 right there in the second round, a 5th rounder, number 141, and a 5th rounder in this upcoming 2025 NFL draft. Pick 39 ended up becoming Braden Fisk. How did it get to be Braden Fisk? Well, the Panthers, they traded that pick away to the Los Angeles Rams, and they also traded away pick one. They traded that away and were able to get pick number 52, pick 155, and well, they got a second rounder for next year. So looking just at that, Brian Burns, trading him, helped the Panthers get a second rounder in this upcoming draft, and they did not have a second rounder because, well, they gave up the farm in order to get to number 1 and take Bryce Young almost 2 years ago there in the 2023 NFL draft. So getting rid of Brian Burns helped the Panthers get back that second round pick. Now, what they do with it will be interesting to find out whether truly they made the right decision. Also, that 5th rounder they had at 141 that they got, that helped to get Xavier Legette in the first round as they sent 33 and 141 to Buffalo in order to get who they were hoping and still are can be a top receiver for this team for years to come, plus the 5th-year option. So getting rid of Brian Burns led to Xavier Legette and led to the Panthers getting a second-round pick in this upcoming draft as well. And then we will find out what the 2025 5th rounder ends up being. So just on the surface right now, the Panthers got rid of Burns and they've come away with Xavier Legette. They've come away with a second round pick this upcoming year. Oh, and by the way, think about it. That second rounder that they had at 39 and they traded back, they got 52, they got 155 in the second rounder next year. Well, they ended up using 52 in order to move up. Actually, no, they used 52 in order to actually get Jonathan Brooks, their running back out of Texas. So not only did Brian Burns yield the Panthers Xavier Legette and a second rounder to be named later here in 2025, it also led to them getting Jonathan Brooks. It's not about what you got compensation-wise, as it wasn't impressive, a second rounder and 2 fifths. But looking at it now, it's not just that. It's a starting wide receiver. It's your future at running back, hopefully, if he can stay healthy moving forward. And it's another likely impact player coming up in the second round. So taking all of that into consideration and looking at the current state of affairs with this edge rusher group. The Panthers went from being last in sacks in 2023 with Burns with only 27 up to 29th in the league in 2024 with 31 sacks. So they got 4 more this year. They ranked 30th in pressure percentage with Brian Burns back in 2023 at a 17.2% rate. This past season, they were at 15.5, which is not great without Brian Burns. They brought in Jadeveon Clowney. They brought in DJ Wonnum. And Wonnum, I think, has an ability to be here for a couple of years. Now, Clowney's always been an older prospect. He was not going to be a long-term guy for Carolina, and we'll see what they decide to do this offseason. But he was not a better player than Burns this year. He was in 2023 up in Baltimore. And I think the situation with all the talent around him helped, especially him being healthy as well, helped out. But he wasn't better than Burns was this year. And did Burns make a massive impact in New York? No. The Giants didn't win a lot of games. In fact, they lost more games to the Panthers. And, of course, they lost to the Panthers there in Munich, where Brian Burns wasn't really a factor. He had a sack early on. I think that was more of the turf monster getting Bryce Young on an opening drive than was Brian Burns making a big-time play. So looking at all of this, they trade away Brian Burns. They got the second. They got the 2/5. They felt comfortable enough with an extra second to send one of the fifths that they got from the Giants, plus the secondary they had at 33 to Buffalo to get Xavier Legette. Then, with that second-round pick that they had, they used the Rams' desperation and traded back, got a second-rounder for this upcoming year, and hopefully a player who can be an impact player for them later down the road. And they moved back to 52. And at 52, they took Jonathan Brooks, who, yes, tore his ACL for the second time in 13 months in that same knee back in December. Hate to see that for him. We'll see whether he can come back and be an impact player this upcoming season. Unlikely. And what will he look like in 2026 and beyond? But looking at that, they gave away Burns, traded away Burns, because words matter. They traded away Brian Burns, got Xavier Legette, a starter at receiver, Jonathan Brooks, a future hopeful starter at running back, and then a player coming up here in the second round of the 2025 NFL draft who also should be expected to be a starter. So we're talking about this in a couple of years that you landed one of your top receivers, your starting running back, and another starter for you, potentially on the defensive side of the ball. How can you sit back and not say the Panthers made the right decision to give away Brian Burns? So right now, without knowing who that second-round pick is and what they're going to do with that second-round pick that they were able to get, and also not knowing what they're doing with that fifth-round pick coming up in 2025, I'm giving this trade a B. A year ago, when I saw it, didn't love it. Would have given it a C-, maybe even a D, just because of the compensation. But I wasn't surprised by the compensation because they were never going to get what they were offered by LA back when Burns hadn't even ended the final year in Carolina as far as his rookie year. And he didn't have to have the franchise tag slapped on him just yet. They were never going to get that compensation. But to take what Dan Morgan and the organization received and to turn that into a second and a fifth rounder that coming up here this upcoming year, to turn into Xavier Legette and Jonathan Brooks, that is a very positive start. And you want to be able to give away a player like Burns, trade him away. You want to be able to trade away a player like Burns for some picks and then be able to bring in maybe 3-4 players based off of that compensation who can improve your team. Because he's, again, only one guy, an important piece to what the Carolina Panthers wanted to do, and also an important piece now what the New York Giants want to do. But again, one player. They have a potential now to add 4 players to that one. And so far, 2 that they have, mixed results. With the next 2, could end up being the difference for this franchise moving forward. So right now, did they make the right decision to give up Brian Burns? Well, yeah, kind of hard to say no at this point in time. So final grade as of right now is a B. We'll continue to look back at this after the draft once the Panthers decide what to do with that 2025 fifth-round pick that they got from the Brian Burns trade, and then the second-round pick they were able to get also because of the Brian Burns trade, even though not directly as they got that from the Rams. That's where things stand as we revisited the Carolina Panthers trading away Brian Burns almost a year ago. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Friday I'll be back answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding. And coming up on tomorrow's show, we're going to relive the Deontay Johnson trade saga and find out whether that actually also worked out for the Carolina Panthers. All that coming up tomorrow on Locked On Panthers.